Montgomery failed. And in any normal command structure, that failure would have ended careers. Not slowly, not politely, immediately. Commanders are removed for less, quietly reassigned, publicly blamed, sometimes erased from the story altogether. War does not reward hesitation, and it does not tolerate visible mistakes at the top. When plans collapse, someone pays for it. That is how armies maintain obedience, how alliances preserve trust, how leaders signal control. But Montgomery didn't fall. Instead, Winston Churchill stepped in, not with a speech, not with a public defense, but with pressure applied in the right places at the right moments. The result was simple. Montgomery stayed. The failure was absorbed. The consequences were redirected elsewhere. This is usually where the story turns sentimental. Churchill, the loyal leader. Churchill standing by his general. Churchill forgiving a man who would later prove his worth. That version is comforting. It is also misleading. Because this wasn't forgiveness, it was strategy. And to understand why, you have to stop thinking like a general judging another general. You have to think like a politician managing decline, leverage, and survival inside a coalition that was never as unified as the photographs suggest. What most people believe is straightforward. Montgomery made errors. The situation was difficult. War is chaotic. Churchill understood that. He chose patience over punishment. End of story. But that explanation only works if wars are governed by merit. They aren't. Wars, especially coalition wars, are governed by optics, bargaining power, and perception of relevance. Performance matters, but what matters more is what performance represents. Who gains ground when someone falls? Who fills the vacuum? Who writes the narrative afterward? And this is where the comfortable version collapses. Because if this were about competence alone, Montgomery would not have survived the failure. The pressure to remove him was real. It was immediate, and it came from multiple directions at once. Inside Allied command, credibility was already fragile. Trust had to be constantly renegotiated between British and American leadership, between field commanders and political overseers, between egos large enough to fracture coordination at the worst possible moment. Every major setback intensified that pressure. After the failure, the conversation did not revolve around abstract lessons learned. It revolved around accountability, about whether Montgomery had become a liability rather than an asset, about whether his continued presence strengthened the alliance or strained it. This is the part that matters. Failure doesn't just expose mistakes, it exposes power relationships. Once a commander fails publicly, subordinates hesitate. Allies question judgment. Rivals gain an opening. What looks like a tactical problem quickly becomes a political one. And once that happens, removal is often the easiest solution. Clean, symbolic, reassuring. Which is why the expectation inside headquarters was clear. Someone would be sacrificed. Someone had to absorb the shock. Montgomery was the obvious candidate. He was visible. He was controversial. He was already a source of friction. And now he was attached to failure. That combination usually ends one way. So when Churchill blocked that outcome, it sent a signal. Not just that Montgomery would be protected, but that normal rules were being suspended. And when rules are suspended in wartime, it is never accidental. Churchill understood something that is often missed when this moment is retold. Removing Montgomery would not simply have solved a command problem. It would have created a political one far more dangerous. Because Montgomery was not just a man with a rank. He was a symbol, a representative, a piece on a much larger board. And Churchill was not deciding whether Montgomery deserved to stay. He was deciding whether Britain could afford to let him fall. That distinction changes everything. When viewed this way, the protection stops looking generous and starts looking calculated. It stops being about character and becomes about consequences. About what would happen next if Churchill allowed the failure to take its natural course. This wasn't a question of blame. It was a question of damage control. And that is why the real story doesn't begin with the failure itself. It begins with why that failure should have ended Montgomery, and why, for Churchill, that outcome was unacceptable. After a major failure, commanders don't just lose ground, they lose permission. Permission to ask for resources, permission to demand obedience, permission to claim they're the one who sees the battlefield clearly. That permission is fragile. It exists on confidence more than proof. And once it breaks, it doesn't come back because you explain yourself. It comes back only if you win fast enough that nobody has time to keep blaming you. Montgomery's failure didn't give him that luxury, because this wasn't a failure that could be hidden in the fog of war. It was public, it was measurable. It was the kind of operation that was sold as a shortcut, high confidence, high promise, high political value, and then delivered the opposite. Market Garden wasn't framed as one possible option. It was framed as the answer, a bold thrust, a clean breakthrough, a plan that would end the mess faster. And that framing matters, because in coalition war, the higher the promise, the more brutal the backlash when it collapses. If you tell people, give me the fuel, give me the planes, give me priority, and I will deliver, you have just made a political transaction. You've converted trust into a gamble. And if you lose that gamble, your failure isn't just tactical, it's reputational. That's why commanders get removed after defeats. Not because leaders suddenly discover that war is dangerous, but because defeat exposes who was wrong in public. And Montgomery was wrong in public. He asked for priority, he got it. He asked for risk, he got it. He asked for belief, he got it. Then Arnhem didn't fall. The corridor became a vulnerability. The timetable evaporated, casualties mounted, momentum stalled, and the Allies didn't get a victory they could sell. They got an argument they couldn't stop. That's the first reason his career should have been in danger. The failure wasn't just a loss. It was a failed claim of superiority. The second reason was worse. Montgomery wasn't just attached to the plan. He was attached to the tone. He didn't operate like a quiet technician. He operated like a man who wanted to be seen as the decisive brain of the Western Front. And inside Allied command, that kind of posture creates enemies even when you're winning. Especially when you're British, commanding in a coalition where the center of gravity was shifting toward the Americans in real time. By 1944, everyone could see the trajectory. American manpower, American production, American logistics. This was becoming an American-led war in practice, even if the alliance still spoke the language of partnership. Britain still mattered, but Britain's leverage depended on one thing: proving it was still indispensable. Montgomery was one of the last British commanders who could credibly claim that status, which meant he was more than a general. He was a pressure point, and pressure points attract hands. Inside headquarters, there were already people who didn't just disagree with Montgomery's decisions. They resented his influence. They disliked his certainty. They were tired of being treated as supporting actors in someone else's narrative of victory. Even when the Allies agreed on objectives, they fought over approach. Narrow thrust versus broader pressure. Priority for one army group versus share the fuel. Tactical debate disguised what it always disguises: power struggle. Montgomery's failure didn't create that struggle, it gave it teeth. Because after Market Garden, criticism wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a body count. It had photographs. It had letters home. It had a map where the arrow stopped short of the promised outcome. And now the question wasn't, was the plan bold? The question became, why did we gamble so much on one man's certainty? That's when the real institutional reflex kicks in. Not the reflex of generals, the reflex of systems. Systems protect themselves. They don't tolerate a visible crack near the top because cracks invite collapse. When an operation fails, systems move to isolate the damage. They look for a single point to blame. They look for a narrative that restores confidence. They look for a sacrifice that allows everyone else to keep functioning without admitting the structure itself might be flawed. Montgomery was perfect for that role. He was the face of the plan, He was outspoken. He was already divisive. And he was British, meaning his removal could be framed as accountability without destabilizing American domestic morale. That last point is brutal, but it's how coalitions behave under stress. Every alliance member is running two wars at once, the one against the enemy and the one against internal political erosion. For the Americans, the risk was simple. If Montgomery is seen as the man consuming resources and delivering setbacks, then why keep treating Britain as an equal partner in operational priority? Why not shift more weight to American commanders, American plans, American control? For British leadership, that risk was existential, because once priority shifts, it rarely returns. Influence doesn't come back because you ask nicely. It comes back only if you can force the alliance to need you again. And Montgomery's failure gave American voices inside the coalition an argument they didn't even have to sharpen. The facts did it for them. But here's the key. Montgomery's danger wasn't only external, it was internal. Within the British military and political sphere, failure created another problem: credibility at home. Parliament, press, public. Britain had already paid years of blood and austerity. British morale was not maintained by truth, it was maintained by narrative. And narrative needs heroes who look competent, not gambles that fail spectacularly. If Montgomery becomes a symbol of overreach, Churchill doesn't just lose a general. He risks losing a propaganda asset, a psychological pillar, a reassuring image of British competence in a war that increasingly looked like it would be finished with American weight. That's why the normal outcome after such a failure is swift removal or quiet sidelining. Because it restores order. It tells everyone the system is still clean, mistakes are punished, leadership is accountable. And in Montgomery's case, the normal outcome would have been easy to justify. He had rivals, he had critics, he had a record of conflict with peers. He had a style that created friction even when his results were strong. After the failure, those critics didn't have to invent accusations. They just had to point. What people miss is that removal isn't always about the plan. It's about the person's relationship to the coalition. A commander can survive a tactical failure if everyone still trusts him as a partner. If allies believe he's honest, flexible, and safe to coordinate with. If he can lose without making everyone else feel stupid for following him. Montgomery did not have that kind of goodwill banked. He had reputation, he had status, he had a following. But goodwill? That's different. Goodwill is what keeps knives in their sheaths when things go wrong. And after Market Garden, the knives were out, because many people felt they had been dragged into a gamble they didn't fully control, and then forced to absorb the consequences. That is why, in any normal command structure, his position would have been unstable. Because after failure, the coalition doesn't ask, was he brave? It asks, is he still worth the trouble? And that is the point where Montgomery should have been isolated, reduced, replaced. Which is exactly why Churchill's intervention matters. Because Churchill didn't just protect a general from criticism. He protected him from the system's instinct to cleanse itself by sacrificing him. And when a political leader overrides that instinct, it's never because he's being sentimental. It's because he's calculating the next chain reaction. You can almost feel the logic inside headquarters after the failure. Quiet conversations, polite language masking sharp intent, the same names circulating in the same rooms. The same conclusion forming without being spoken directly. This is the moment to cut Montgomery down to size. And then Churchill blocks it, not loudly, not dramatically, but effectively. Which means Churchill believed that letting Montgomery fall would cost him more than the failure itself. And once you accept that, the story becomes clear. This wasn't a defense of talent, it was a defense of leverage. If you're still here, you already understand why this matters. Because this is how power actually functions in wartime. Not in speeches, in decisions that protect symbols, preserve bargaining position, and control blame. And the next step is the most important one. Because now we have to answer the real question. What did Churchill stand to lose if Montgomery was removed? Churchill's decision only looks irrational if you believe the war was being run like a clean meritocracy. It wasn't. By the time Montgomery failed, Britain was fighting on two fronts, one against Germany, one against becoming the junior partner inside its own alliance. That second front is the one most histories soften, because it's uncomfortable, because it sounds cynical, because it admits that Allied unity was a negotiated performance. But Churchill didn't have the luxury of pretending. He knew exactly what was happening to Britain's position by 1944. The center of gravity was shifting. American manpower was massive. American industry was endless. American logistics could outfeed, outfuel, outproduce everyone else combined. And with that material reality came something more powerful: the right to decide. Coalitions don't stay equal. They tilt toward whoever can carry the most weight. And as they tilt, the weaker partner has only two ways to stay relevant: either remain indispensable in a specific role, or maintain symbols strong enough that the stronger partner hesitates to push them aside. Montgomery was one of those symbols, not because he was flawless, not because everyone loved him, not because he was always right, because he was visible. He was British. He was the public face of British operational authority on the Western Front. He was the general the public could name, the one newspapers could frame as our man inside a coalition that was increasingly being powered by American scale. So when people say Churchill protected Montgomery, they picture an old leader defending a proud commander. That's not what happened. Churchill protected an asset, a bargaining chip, a piece that made Britain harder to ignore. Because if Montgomery goes down publicly, the damage isn't limited to one man. It hits Britain's credibility as a senior war partner. It makes it easier for American command to argue, quietly and logically, that operational control should shift further toward American hands. And once that shift happens, it does not reverse. That is the first reality. Montgomery's fall would have strengthened forces inside the alliance that Churchill couldn't afford to empower. The second reality is even colder. Churchill could not allow a story to form where Britain's leading battlefield figure is exposed as reckless, overrated, or politically protected in a way that reeks of weakness. Because in coalition war, perception is power, and weakness invites reallocation. Reallocation of resources, reallocation of priority, reallocation of prestige. Fuel goes where confidence goes. Air support goes where trust goes. Momentum goes where leadership appears decisive. If Montgomery is publicly blamed, then Britain is publicly diminished. And if Britain is diminished, Churchill loses leverage in every closed-door negotiation that matters. That's why this wasn't about whether Montgomery deserved consequences. It was about who would own the narrative of the Western Front. You can see it in the structure of Allied decision-making. There's the battlefield plan, and then there's the political agreement that allows the battlefield plan to exist. Britain needed more than victories. It needed proof that it still shaped the war, not just participated in it. And Montgomery, for all his flaws, was one of the few British commanders positioned to represent that proof at scale. So Churchill couldn't let him fall, because that fall would have created a vacuum. And vacuums get filled. Who fills them? Not the most competent man in the room. The man whose country can afford to fill them. The man whose resources make him inevitable. The man the coalition already depends on. Which means if Montgomery is removed, Britain doesn't simply replace him with another British general and move on like nothing happened. That's not how power works inside an alliance. Britain replaces him only if the Americans accept the replacement as equally legitimate. And after a failure, especially a high-profile one, the Americans would have had every reason to say, we should shift priority to our own chain of command. Not as an insult, as an efficiency measure, as a reasonable recalibration. Churchill saw that trap. He also saw something else. Montgomery's removal would have made Churchill look weak at home. Because the public wasn't watching coalition politics. The public was watching whether Britain still looked like a first-tier power. And first-tier powers do not have their most famous commanders cut down in public by alliance pressure. That kind of humiliation doesn't just hurt morale. It reshapes how a nation sees its own status. Churchill's entire wartime leadership depended on projecting strength and inevitability. Not fantasy, not arrogance, resolve. Montgomery functioned inside that projection. If Montgomery is publicly discarded after failure, it creates a story that Britain's best is no longer enough, that Britain is being managed, that Britain is no longer steering. And Churchill could not let that story consolidate. So he made the only move that preserved Britain's position. He contained the failure without sacrificing the symbol. This is the part where people assume Churchill must have been blinded by loyalty. But loyalty is messy. Loyalty creates exceptions without structure. Churchill's protection had structure. It was targeted. It was strategic. It was designed to prevent a chain reaction. Because the true danger of Montgomery's failure wasn't the battlefield itself. It was what the failure enabled inside the alliance. It enabled rivals to say, "This is why we can't keep giving him priority." It enabled planners to say, "This is why we need different leadership." It enabled politicians to say, "This is why Britain should accept a smaller role." And Churchill's job wasn't to be fair. It was to keep Britain from sliding into irrelevance while the war was still being decided. He couldn't let Montgomery fall because Montgomery's fall would have been interpreted as Britain's fall, which means Churchill's calculation was brutally simple. The cost of keeping Montgomery was manageable. The cost of losing him was structural. And when leaders choose between manageable damage and structural loss, they choose damage. Every time. If you want the clean version of history, this moment makes no sense. If you want the real version, it's obvious. Churchill wasn't defending a man. He was defending Britain's bargaining position inside the alliance. And that's why the protection happened. But there's still one piece missing, because protection is never free. And Churchill didn't protect Montgomery by doing nothing. He protected him by negotiating, through messaging, through control, through limits, so that Montgomery remained useful without becoming untouchable. That's the deal people don't see, not the public story, the private terms. People imagine protection as a shield. A leader stands in front of you, takes the hits, absorbs the blame, carries you through the storm. That's not how real protection works. Real protection is a transaction. It's a set of conditions, a trade of autonomy for survival, a controlled narrative in exchange for continued relevance. And when it happens at the top of a coalition war, it doesn't look like an emotional decision. It looks like silence. It looks like pressure applied behind doors that never make it into memoirs. Churchill didn't protect Montgomery by pretending the failure never happened. He protected him by controlling what the failure meant. That's the difference. Because you can't erase a visible setback. You can only contain it. You can limit how far the blame spreads. You can redirect the story away from Montgomery is finished and towards something safer. This was unfortunate, but necessary. This was bold, but unlucky. This was complex, but not disqualifying. That shift doesn't happen naturally. It has to be engineered. And engineering it requires leverage, political leverage, institutional leverage, narrative leverage. Churchill had all three. Start with the simplest fact. Coalition command lives on the edge of public confidence. Not just military confidence, political confidence. American voters, British voters, governments, parliaments, newspapers. The war effort needed a story that stayed coherent. Failure threatened coherence. And incoherence is dangerous because it invites questions leaders cannot afford to answer in the middle of a war. So Churchill's first move wasn't to defend Montgomery's judgment as perfect. His first move was to prevent the failure from becoming a referendum on British leadership. That's why the public story mattered so much. Because the public story is never aimed at the public. It's aimed at everyone watching the public, allies, rivals, neutral states, domestic opposition, even officers inside the chain of command. A commander can survive a defeat if the defeat is framed as part of a continuing strategy. He cannot survive if the defeat is framed as proof that his country's influence is inflated and undeserved. So Churchill's protection began with containment. Containment means tightening the language, restricting how the operation is discussed, making sure it's treated as a setback, never a humiliation. Making sure it doesn't become a symbol of reckless British overreach. That doesn't require lies, it requires emphasis. You highlight what went right. You focus on effort. You frame the failure as the result of friction, weather, unexpected resistance, timing, anything that softens bad decision into hard environment. Because hard environment preserves credibility, bad decision kills it. But containment alone isn't enough. Because inside Allied headquarters, nobody cares what newspaper headlines say. They care about the political permission those headlines create. If the narrative hardens into Montgomery gambled and failed, then internal actors gain freedom to demand his removal. They can present it as rational, necessary, inevitable. Churchill couldn't allow inevitability to form, which meant his protection had to extend into the internal chain of command. And that's where the real deal lives. Protection inside a coalition war is not a speech. It's a sequence of subtle acts. Who gets blamed? Who gets reassigned? What reviews are launched? What language is used in communiques? What private meetings happen without minutes? What understandings are reached without being written down? The deal is not a single agreement, it's a structure. Here is what Churchill needed from that structure. First, Montgomery remains in position, publicly, clearly. No temporary relief, no reassignment for health, no humiliation disguised as administrative routine, because any obvious downgrade would still signal weakness. And weakness is exactly what Churchill was preventing. Second, the failure does not create a precedent that Britain can be disciplined by coalition pressure. That is a dangerous precedent. Once your ally learns it can force your hand, it will do it again. Not because it hates you, because it works. Churchill had to make sure that even if Montgomery was criticized, the final decision remained a British decision. That distinction matters. It preserves sovereignty inside the alliance. Third, Montgomery remains useful, but not uncontained. This is crucial. Keeping him in command wasn't enough. Churchill had to manage what Montgomery would do next. Because Montgomery's greatest risk wasn't that he would fail again. It was that he would keep behaving like an independent power center. That kind of posture is survivable when you're winning. After a failure, it becomes intolerable. So the protection came with limits. Limits on autonomy. Limits on messaging. Limits on how much he could antagonize peers. Limits on the kind of public confidence he could project without creating internal revolt. In other words, Montgomery could stay, but he could not become untouchable. That's the part people miss. When Churchill shielded Montgomery, he didn't make him invincible, he made him manageable. And the way you make a powerful figure manageable is by converting him into a controlled asset. You tie his survival to your political support. You remind him, quietly, who can remove him and who can keep him. You create dependency. That dependency is the price of protection. And it's not just personal, it's institutional. Because Churchill's protection also had to be acceptable to other British officials, to the chiefs of staff, to politicians who understood how fragile alliance optics were, to commanders who resented Montgomery but understood the damage of losing him. That acceptance required another tactic: redirect blame without detonating trust. This is where political strategy becomes cold. If you want to protect someone after failure, you don't declare them innocent. You reduce the intensity of the accusation by widening responsibility just enough that it becomes systemic rather than personal. Not so wide that the whole system looks broken, just wide enough that one man doesn't have to be sacrificed. So blame becomes circumstances, complexity, friction, unexpected resistance, timing, communications, weather, logistical constraints. All of it may be true, but the point isn't truth. The point is distribution. Because distributed blame is survivable, concentrated blame is lethal. And Churchill needed Montgomery to survive. But again, protection is never free. To make this work, Churchill had to ensure the coalition did not feel like it was being ignored. Because if the Americans perceived that Britain was stubbornly protecting a failed commander out of pride, the backlash would be immediate. It would show up in resource allocation, in priority, in cooperation, in tone. So the deal had another layer: reassure the Americans without surrendering control. That means acknowledging the setback enough to appear rational, while refusing to treat it as disqualifying. It means promising coordination, promising improved process, promising review, promising lessons learned, but never offering the one thing critics wanted: Montgomery's removal. This balance is delicate. It requires Churchill to play two audiences at once. To the British public and Parliament, the message is strength. Britain's commander remains. Britain remains central. To the American leadership, the message is stability. Britain isn't spiraling. Britain can still deliver. Britain is still a disciplined partner. And to Montgomery himself, the message is unspoken but unmistakable. You are here because you are useful, and because I choose it. You will not make me regret that choice. That's the political bargain. And it produces the most important effect of all. It freezes the moment. It prevents the failure from turning into a leadership purge. It stops the system's instinct to cleanse itself. It blocks the chain reaction that would have shifted alliance power further away from Britain. In exchange, Montgomery loses something. He loses freedom. He loses the ability to act like he is above coalition politics, because now he is not just a general, he is a protected piece, and protected pieces come with strings. This is why calling it forgiveness is wrong. Forgiveness is moral. This was mechanical. Churchill didn't absolve Montgomery, he contained him, and containment is a form of control. Which sets up the next consequence, one that spreads through headquarters like a virus. Because once people see that politics can override performance, they stop behaving like soldiers and start behaving like actors inside a power system. They adjust, they reposition, they compete differently. And that changes the entire command environment. Once Churchill protected Montgomery, the battlefield didn't change first, the room changed. Headquarters is where alliances actually function. The front line is where blood is spent. The headquarters is where influence is traded. And the moment it becomes clear that a commander survived failure because of political shielding, everyone inside the system recalibrates. Not emotionally, strategically. Because now they understand a new rule. Some people are kept in place by performance. Others are kept in place by politics. And once that rule becomes visible, it contaminates everything. It changes how officers interpret orders. It changes how colleagues share information. It changes how planning meetings feel. It changes what people say out loud and what they say for private conversations. It turns cooperation into caution and caution into rivalry. This is the hidden cost of protection. Saving one man can destabilize an entire command structure because it forces everyone else to confront an uncomfortable reality. Outcomes aren't decided purely on competence. They're decided on leverage. And if leverage is the real currency, then everyone starts trying to acquire it. That's where the poison begins. Start with Montgomery's rivals. Before the failure, rivalry could be framed as professional disagreement, strategy debate, personality clash, different doctrines, different tempos. After the failure, rivalry becomes moralized. Because now critics can say, "We warned you. We doubted this. We didn't believe the plan. We were right." And when Churchill blocks consequences, those critics don't disappear. They harden. They don't stop thinking Montgomery is a liability. They start thinking the system is rigged in his favor. That belief is corrosive, because it turns every future decision into a suspicion. If Montgomery proposes a plan, is it being chosen because it's sound, or because he's protected? If Montgomery receives resources, is it because his sector needs them, or because political priority demands it? If Montgomery is praised publicly, is it genuine, or is it narrative management? You can't run a coalition command on suspicion, but suspicion is exactly what political shielding creates. It doesn't even matter whether the suspicion is fair. It only matters that it becomes plausible. And it becomes plausible the moment a man survives a failure that should have ended him. Now look at Montgomery's supporters. Protection doesn't just create resentment, it creates overconfidence. If you see your commander survive what should have destroyed him, you don't read that as he's being managed. You read it as he's untouchable. And that belief can make people reckless in a different way. It encourages loyalty that stops being analytical. It discourages honest feedback. It makes subordinates less likely to challenge assumptions because they assume the political machine behind their leader will continue to shield him. That's how protected figures become dangerous. Not because they're incompetent, but because the environment around them starts filtering reality to keep the protected figure strong. Then there's the American side of the coalition. This is where the consequences become structural. Americans weren't simply watching a British general survive failure. They were watching Britain assert political control over accountability inside a shared command system. And that sends a clear message. Britain will not be managed like a subordinate partner, even when circumstances would justify it. Depending on who you are, you interpret that message differently. If you're sympathetic to Britain, you read it as sovereignty, necessary pride, alliance balance. If you're impatient, you read it as stubbornness, inefficiency, ego. Either way, it changes the calculation of future cooperation. Because now, when American commanders negotiate priorities, they do it with a different assumption. British decisions may be politically insulated. British symbols may be protected even when they create friction. British leadership may resist rational reallocation. That doesn't break the alliance. It hardens it. And hardened alliances are slower. They require more meetings, more compromise, more bureaucratic friction, more careful language, more back-channel arrangements, more time spent negotiating what should be simple decisions. In a war where time is blood, that friction matters. But the deepest consequence is psychological. Churchill's protection created a split reality inside HQ. On the surface, everything continues. Orders, briefings, plans, cooperation. Underneath, everyone starts playing a second game. The second game is positioning. Who is protected? Who has political backing? Whose failure will be forgiven? Whose will be punished? Who can take risks safely? Who cannot? That second game is deadly because it shifts incentives away from pure effectiveness and toward optics. Officers become cautious about owning decisions. They spread responsibility. They write memos that protect them. They avoid being associated with plans that might fail. They become more concerned with being blame-proof than being bold. That isn't cowardice, it's adaptation. And adaptation is rational when the system signals that accountability is selective. This is how command structures rot, not through incompetence, through distorted incentives. Montgomery's protection made incentive distortion visible. Now, this doesn't mean Churchill's move was wrong. It means it had a price. And that price shows up in small ways first. A planning meeting becomes colder. A liaison officer becomes less open. A commander delays agreement until he has written cover. A subordinate avoids delivering bad news upward. A rival leaks criticism sideways. A staff officer frames a briefing to avoid giving Montgomery credit. None of it looks dramatic. That's the point. Politics in war rarely looks like a knife. It looks like a slow shift in atmosphere until decisions become heavier and trust becomes thinner. And that atmosphere was already under strain before the failure. Montgomery didn't have a reputation for warmth. He had a reputation for certainty. Certainty can inspire troops. It can also suffocate cooperation. When a certain man is protected after failure, he doesn't become humbler by default. Sometimes he becomes more entrenched. Sometimes he becomes more convinced that history is on his side. Sometimes he becomes more willing to challenge peers because he believes political backing proves he is essential. Even if he never says it, others feel it. And when others feel it, they respond. This is the irony. Churchill's protection preserved Britain's leverage, but it also made Montgomery more politically radioactive inside the coalition. It increased the cost of dealing with him. It forced everyone to consider not only what Montgomery wanted, but what Churchill might intervene to ensure. That creates a new layer of calculation inside every operational decision. Because now Montgomery isn't just a general with opinions. He's a general who has a political guarantor. And political guarantors change power dynamics. So what happens next is predictable. Rivals intensify their efforts to sideline him quietly. Supporters intensify their efforts to elevate him publicly. Americans intensify their efforts to reduce dependence on British priority. Staff structures intensify their efforts to manage conflict through process. The war still moves forward, but it moves with more internal resistance. That is the cost of saving. And it leads to the final truth Churchill was willing to accept. Because Churchill did not protect Montgomery because he believed Montgomery's performance deserved immunity. He protected him because removing him would have been worse for Britain's influence than the internal damage caused by keeping him. That's the whole logic, stripped of myth. You don't make decisions like this when you're trying to be fair. You make them when you're trying to survive as a power. And that brings us to the verdict, the only conclusion that matches the actions. This is the point where history tries to soften the edge. It turns Churchill into a loyal patron, Montgomery into a misunderstood genius, the failure into a necessary price for boldness. But if you follow the logic, cleanly, coldly, that version doesn't hold. Churchill didn't protect Montgomery because Montgomery was right. He protected him because losing him was worse. Worse for Britain's position. Worse for Britain's leverage. Worse for Britain's ability to sit at the same table as the Americans and still be treated as a partner rather than a dependent. That's the part that makes people uncomfortable because it reveals what coalition leadership actually is. It isn't an argument about who deserves what. It's an argument about what you can afford to lose. After the failure, Montgomery was exposed. Not as a villain, not as a fraud, as a risk. A risk to trust inside Allied command. A risk to operational cohesion. A risk to the credibility of British planning. A risk to relationships that were already strained. And in a normal structure, you remove the risk. Because you can't let one man's reputation pull down the system around him. But Churchill's job was not to protect the system as an abstract ideal. Churchill's job was to protect Britain. And Britain's problem in 1944 wasn't simply winning battles. It was remaining central in an alliance where power was shifting away from it every month. That shift wasn't personal, it was arithmetic. More American divisions, more American supplies, more American aircraft, more American money. And arithmetic produces hierarchy. Churchill understood that if Britain lost its most visible operational symbol on the Western Front, it wouldn't just lose prestige, it would lose bargaining power. The kind you need when negotiating strategy, priority, post-war influence, everything. So Churchill calculated. He looked at the options the way leaders actually look at options in wartime. Option 1, sacrifice Montgomery. Restore internal cohesion, satisfy critics, signal accountability, but accept the deeper cost. Britain's stature takes a public hit. Americans gain more justification to take more control, and Britain becomes easier to sideline the next time priorities are negotiated. Option 2, protect Montgomery. Contain the failure, control the narrative, accept the internal friction, accept the resentment, accept the suspicion. But preserve the symbol, preserve British leverage, and prevent the alliance power balance from tilting even faster away from Britain. He chose option 2, not because it was clean, because it was survivable. This is what people miss when they treat wartime decisions like morality plays. War leadership is rarely about what is right. It is about what is less catastrophic. And losing Montgomery, publicly, decisively, under coalition pressure, would have been catastrophic in the specific way Churchill feared most. It would have made Britain look expendable. That word matters. Coalitions keep you close as long as you appear necessary. The moment you appear expendable, your influence shrinks. Your voice is heard less. Your priorities get delayed. Your plans become inputs, not direction. Churchill wasn't going to allow that trajectory to accelerate because one operation failed. So he took the political hit instead of the strategic. And when you understand that, the protection becomes obvious. It wasn't personal, it wasn't emotional, it was leverage management. Montgomery didn't survive because he earned it. He survived because Churchill decided that the alliance could absorb his failure, but Britain could not absorb his removal. That's the verdict. And it leads to the real lesson, one that applies far beyond this story. In coalition war, decisions are made to preserve influence, not reward performance. Leaders don't ask who deserves to fall, they ask who can fall without taking the whole structure with them. Montgomery was too costly to lose. Not because he was flawless, because the symbolism attached to him was strategically valuable. So Churchill protected him. And the deal nobody saw wasn't a handshake or a secret promise. It was the unspoken truth that governs war at the highest level. Sometimes the person who should be punished is the person you cannot afford to sacrifice. Not because he's right, because the alternative is worse.